Okay, in this video, we are going to look at the movement of substances across the plasma membrane. So it is divided into two big categories, namely passive transport and active transport. Okay, so by the name itself, passive and active, there is a distinctive feature to differentiate this, and that is if it is active, it requires energy, but if it is passive, no energy is required in terms of transporting substances. So under passive transport, it is further divided into simple diffusion, osmosis, as well as facilitated diffusion. So let's look at the simplest one, the first one under passive transport, and that is simple diffusion. So this involves the movement of particles, the molecules or the solutes within a gas or a liquid from region of high concentration to region of lower concentration. Okay, so as simple as this. So do you still remember that this is the phospholipid bilayer of the plasma membrane? So we have two regions over here, two compartments, one and compartment number 2. Okay, perhaps this will represent the extracellular fluid, and this is inside the cell or the cytosol. So you can see solids over here depicted, both region, and the difference is that at the outer region over here, the solids are more in numbers as compared to another region inside the cell which is lesser. So simple diffusion tells us that when these two regions has got difference in the concentration gradient of the solutes or the molecules, what will happen is that these molecules or these particles will diffuse from this region of higher concentration of solute into a region that has the lower concentration of particles. So we say, in other words, these particles are moving down from high to low, so it is moving down the concentration gradient. Okay, so there are factors that affect the rate of diffusion. Okay, I'm going to skip this. I think this is quite straightforward. The concentration gradient, key size, temperature. Okay. Diffusion of different types of particles takes place in the opposite direction. So, this is a common example where you're given a cell. Okay, so take this as the unicellular organisms. So this is the nucleus and the cytoplasm, and you get to see the respiratory gases, oxygen and also carbon dioxide. So when oxygen diffuses into the cell, at the same time carbon dioxide diffuses out. Okay, so diffusion occurs in living as well as non-living systems. So in this case, it is showing us the living system, and that is the organism. Because now let's talk about oxygen. So surrounding area here has got high concentration of oxygen. Oxygen as compared to the organisms, within the organisms has lower concentration of oxygen because the cells undergo respiration, so it is using or consuming those oxygen. Therefore, concentration of oxygen within the cells is lower as compared to the outer. That's why simple diffusion is going to happen where oxygen from high concentration gradient is going to diffuse into the cell with lower oxygen concentration. Okay, and the opposite happens to the carbon dioxide. Okay, because carbon dioxide is the byproduct of respiration, so a lot of carbon dioxide is being produced from respiration, causing accumulation of carbon dioxide. So what happened is that this carbon dioxide from high concentration region is going to diffuse out to the surrounding, which relatively has lower concentration of carbon dioxide gas. Okay, the second type of passive transport is osmosis. So similar to diffusion, but it involves only the water molecules. Okay, remember, this is special for water transport. We call it as osmosis. Okay, just now, when we talk about simple diffusion, we are referring to the particles, the molecules or the solutes. But now, we are going to focus on the water particles, water molecules. Okay, so osmosis refers to the net movement of water molecules from area or region with high water potential to area of low water potential randomly. Okay, don't forget, you need to add in this fact is that it is through a selectively permeable membrane. Selectively permeable membrane. Just now, when we discuss simple osmosis, okay, we did not actually mention the plasma membrane, the selectively permeable membrane. Okay, so in osmosis, that movement. Okay, so it's the water molecules. Remember always that it is the water molecules that we are referring to, the movement of these water molecules. So again, it is down the concentration gradient. So when we say high water potential, we always focus on water when it is when we talk about osmosis. So when we talk about high water potential, we have to interpret or understand that that region with high water potential has relatively got lower solids concentration. Okay, maksudnya high water potential here kawasan yang lebih cair. Okay, low water potential, so that means relatively they are having high solids concentration, kawasan yang lebih pekat. Okay, so this is osmosis. So the selectively permeable membrane is permeable to water. Okay, remember water is the main character when we talk about osmosis, but impermeable to some solutes, okay, such as sucrose molecules. Okay, the same situation occurs in cells through the phospholipid bilayer. Okay, let's look at picture. This, okay, this diagram. Okay, so in the middle here, this partition is the selectively permeable membrane. So we have again two areas or region. Okay, let's look at solution A. This is solution A. Let's identify the water molecules. So, which is the water molecules? Okay, a lot of water, the smaller ones. The smaller ones as compared to the bigger circles. So the smaller ones represent the water molecules. Okay, whereas in solution B, okay, which has high sucrose concentration, meaning low water potential. Let's look at the molecules now. This compartment or this region has got more bigger circles. That means high sucrose concentration as compared to water molecules, water concentration. So osmosis, what does osmosis tells us just now? It says, okay, it will results in the net movement of water molecules from area of high water potential to area of low water potential. So directly here, we know that solution A has got higher water potential as compared to solution B. So there'll be net movement of water molecules from A to B. Okay, always remember it is the water molecules that is moving across the selectively permeable membrane. Okay, we are not talking about the movement of the sucrose molecule. So please bear this in mind. These sucrose molecules doesn't move, they stays at where they are because these selectively permeable membrane only allows water to diffuse through. Okay, so let's look at this. This is whisking tubing. Here, first please remember to identify the area or the two regions. So in this case, within the whisking tubing is one region, okay, with 20% of sucrose solution, and it is surrounded or it is immersed in the distilled water. So you can see these two compartments over here, they have different concentration, okay, water concentration. Okay, same goes to this condition over here, but reverse is that the distilled water is now within the whisking tubing, immersed or it is surrounded by the solution outside, which is 20% of sucrose solution. So after 2 hours, predict the observation. So what is the first step to do? Identify the region. Which one has got higher water potential? Okay, second question is that what does osmosis tells us? That water molecules, well, there will be net movement of water molecules from region of high water potential to low water potential. So let's look at the first condition over here. In these two compartments, which one has got higher water potential? Definitely it is the distilled water. That means they are having more water molecules as compared to the solution within the whisking tubing. So osmosis tells us that there will be net movement of water from where to where across this selectively permeable membrane, okay, yang diwakili oleh this whisking tubing. From where to where? Okay, we have already identified this now. So there will be net movement of molecules from the region of distilled water into the 20% of sucrose solution inside this whisking tubing. Okay, so we know whisking tubing has got this selective permeable membrane, so water will diffuse across it. So you expect to see this will be the observation. If you are to ask to write down the observation, then you are to write this down. This is what you'll be seeing, that the whisking tubing is going to get firmer, or it is going to expand, increase in size after 2 hours. Okay, how about this? Now you can predict already. These two regions, which one has got higher water potential? Now, okay, definitely it's the distilled water. So what happened is that the water molecules from within this compartment is going to diffuse out to the surrounding across the whisking tubing, okay, which is selectively permeable, and therefore kalau air semua keluar, so what do you expect to see? Yes, the whisking tubing is going to shrink in size. It's going to be flaccid if you are to touch it. This one is going to be firm, turgid if you are to touch it. Okay, simple, and that is about water. That is about osmosis. Okay, now let's look at this picture again. This is a U tube. Okay, U tube. So again, there's always a selectively permeable membrane to separate these two regions. Second step is that to identify which region having higher water potential. Okay, by looking at the molecules. Now remember, osmosis is about water molecules. Now, this region here over the left side, okay, has got more water molecules. You see the blue, the small circle, the blue ones, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. As compared to the right region over here has only got 2 water molecules. So the left region is representing high water potential region. Okay, notice this is we're talking about which one has got higher water potential. So very easy to identify. Okay, maybe after 2 hours, this one osmosis will happen. Okay, that means there'll be net movement of water molecules from this region of high water potential to low water potential. Okay, so until the movement, they are going to reach dynamic equilibrium. Dynamic means still moving, but then it has already achieved this equilibrium dynamically. So that means the water is not static. We don't say that the water doesn't move, because there is still a selectively permeable membrane that separates these two regions. So water will diffuse in and out, diffuse across this region dynamically at the dynamic rate, because this condition they have already achieved dynamic equilibrium. Okay, now let's count the water molecules. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So again, this tells us that the water potential at these two regions is already the same. Okay, if you are to count the sucrose molecule, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, let's count over here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Same. So if you're asked to draw in the questions, to draw the outcome or the observation, let's say after 2 hours, you have to work smart by showing that these two regions has now got the equal amount of water molecules, and please do not change the number of molecules of the sucrose at their initial region. So if you have to count the number of sucrose molecules here at the right side, and also over this observation, the sucrose molecule at the right side, they are going to tally, should be the same. Okay, so again, osmosis tells us about the movement of water molecules. Okay, why isn't sucrose moving across or diffusing across? Because sucrose itself is too big, you see. It is also showing you the size relatively bigger to the water molecules, just to let you know that the sucrose molecules cannot diffuse through the selectively permeable membrane. Okay. Okay, so how does osmosis helps in the uptake of water in plants? So this one we are going to discuss further in the subsequent subtopic. But then you can also figure out now, okay, this is the root hair cells of the roots. Okay, so that means now this is the soil compartment, the soil particles, the region, and you get to see the soils of the cells of the root. So this one is extended out because to increase the surface area so that absorption of water is greater. Okay, so now compare the region. If we are to compare, must be two regions. So this is the region which is inside the root hair cells. So we are comparing the cell sept, okay, which is the workhorse, having the compartment, water compartment or the solution, and to compare the soil water. Okay, so high water concentration in the soil solution as compared to the low water concentration in the root hair cells. Okay, especially after you have already siram your pokok. So high water concentration, we're talking about water potential, jangan lupa. Okay, so osmosis tells us that there will be net movement of water molecules from region of high water concentration to a region of low water concentration by osmosis. So you say water from the soil, don't use the terms here, enter, supposed to be diffused. Okay, diffused into the root hair cells by osmosis. Okay, then the cell sap of the root hair cells becomes more dilute than the root cell A over here. Can you see? A and B. So that means this compartment here, the cell sap, the vocal, okay, now is more dilute. So that means higher water potential as compared to region A. So again, that movement of water or osmosis happens. So from this region, it will diffuse into A, and then this one, you compare A and B, A has got higher water potential, and then eventually what will happen is that continuous diffusion of water from the root hair cells to cell A by osmosis. Then cell sap of A becomes more dilute than root in the cell B. Eventually, what happens is that water from A enters or diffuse into cell B by osmosis, and osmosis continues from cell to cell until the water diffuse into the xylem vessels. Okay, you still remember xylem? Xylem is the one that is responsible to transport water and mineral salts. So that is how water can continuously diffuse into the plants. And this is how osmosis is playing role to help in the uptake of water in the plants. Okay, the third transport, passive transport, is that this is facilitated diffusion. So actually the first one, let's recap. We have simple diffusion followed by osmosis. Now it is facilitated diffusion, and all these three transport doesn't require any energy. So what is facilitated diffusion? It is the movement of hydrophilic molecules or ions across the plasma membrane with the help of transport proteins. Okay, so facilitated maksudnya ni dibantu ini. So that's why with the help of transport protein. Okay, so still across the plasma membrane. Okay, I think we look into the examples first. Then you'll be able to see clearly. Okay, so wait. Substances that are not soluble in lipids. Remember the structure of the phospholipid bilayer or not? Mainly, it is made up of phospholipid, isn't it? Phospholipid. So that's those substances that are not lipid soluble, they cannot pass through the phospholipid bilayer. Okay, so if you're asked to give examples, what are they? Glucose, amino acids, proteins, all these do not readily pass through the phospholipid bilayer because they are not soluble in lipids. So that's why kita cakap ini hydrophilic molecules. Hydrophilic maksudnya dia ni love water. Doesn't dissolve in lipids. So how? Bagaimana nasib all these substances? They have to pass across, they have to diffuse across the plasma membrane. So how? They must be facilitated ataupun mereka mesti dibantu. Dibantu oleh siapa? I'm sure you remember the structure of the phospholipid bilayer. Okay, selain daripada phospholipid, you have the proteins, right? Yang embedded within this protein ni ada dua jenis. Sama ada dia ada channel proteins or the carrier proteins. Okay, selagi transport of substances itu adalah dibantu. Okay, dibantu, it is being aided or facilitated by proteins. Then they are categorized under facilitated diffusion. Okay, so let's look at channel proteins. Provide functional pore in the membrane for the diffusions of ions. Okay, remember ions ini, they are hydrophilic. They are not lipid soluble substance. So the pores are selective about which ions can pass through. Okay, bersifat memilih. So again, masih lagi passive transport. So that's why always down the concentration gradient. From high concentration of the solutes, okay, in this case the ions, to a region of low concentration of solutes. That means down the concentration gradient without the use of any energy. Okay, so dia ni bersifat memilih terhadap ion. Dia tidak boleh lalu begini sahaja through the phospholipid bilayer, tapi mesti melalui jambatan. Okay, so this channel protein will open, okay, because they're selective to ions lah, the charges yang dia orang boleh bind, and dia akan lalu dekat jambatan ini, and that is when the channel protein is open. Okay. Now, apa pula cerita carrier protein? So they pick up the diffusion molecules on one side of the membrane. So you see ya, bila kita lukis channel proteins itu selalunya it has got ada satu struktur di sini to show that they are picking up certain molecules on one side. Okay, bila ini buka, then their carrier protein are taking up particles on one side of the plasma membrane, this side. Okay, and then it closes, and then that means this protein, carrier protein here, is playing the role to pick up and then to release, open up and then release at one side, the other side. Still doesn't require any energy, and still it is down the concentration gradient. Okay, so these molecules binds with the certain binding site of the carrier proteins that are complementary. They bind to the certain binding site, they recognize it, and then they are going to help to release them on the other side. Okay, this is example. Absorption of certain nutrients through the villi of the small intestine. So carrier proteins found in the membrane of the cells that line the intestinal wall transport small molecules, amino acids, glucose, into the blood capillaries of the villus. Okay, so it is through a facilitated transport. Okay, ini adalah epithelial cell. Okay, that forms the lining of the villus. Masih ingat villus ini? So this shows the absorption of fructose by the epithelial cells of the villus. Okay, dan eventually dia akan diserap ke dalam. These are the blood vessels. The blood vessels, the red ones and also the blue ones. Okay, not the yellow ones. The yellow one is called the lacteal. Okay, we'll be looking at this structure when you learn about nutrition. So the transport of these glucose amino acids, okay, is through facilitated diffusion. Okay, now we change into another type of transport, and that is called the active transport. It is different from the three transport that we have discussed just now, because the three that we have discussed, they are under passive transport. Yeah, active ini, you see, they involve the movement of particles across the plasma membrane against the concentration gradient, and that is from a region of low concentration to a region of high concentration. Okay. Therefore, sebab dia bergerak melawan concentration gradient, therefore it is not an easy movement, and it requires the input of energy in the form of ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Okay, ini adalah bentuk tenaga that is readily available. Okay, so it can only take place in living organisms sebab dia memerlukan ATP. Okay, remember tenaga energy. Bagaimana tenaga terhasil? Melalui proses respirasi, betul? So that's why respiration is a process that is carried out by living organisms. Kalau dia bukan living organisms, it doesn't undergo or carry out respiration. Therefore, tiada energy, tiada tenaga terhasil. Okay, you understand the first statement? Okay, the second statement says it requires specific carrier proteins. Okay, tadi kita ada dua protein dekat situ, channel and carrier. So, in active transport, kita perlukan carrier protein. Okay, unlike facilitated ni, dua-dua ni boleh as long as dia melibatkan protein, ya, dibantu oleh protein, the movement of substance, we call it facilitated. Tapi, for active transport, specific carrier proteins. Okay, we don't mention channel protein. So these specific carrier proteins will bind to the substrate to be transported, therefore enabling the substance to pass to diffuse rapidly across the plasma membrane. And sometimes you call the carrier proteins as biological pump. Okay, dia ni dipanggil sebagai pump. Okay, in the expense of energy lah, dia perlukan energy, lepas dia bertindak sebagai pump because it has to it has to transport the substance against the concentration gradient. Okay, begini dia punya proses itu. This is called the sodium potassium pump. Okay, ions, pergerakan ions ini. Sodium, Na, potassium, K+. So, again, we have the phospholipid bilayer. This is the plasma membrane lah kan. And this is the carrier protein. So, it has got certain binding sites dekat sini. So, the first step is that you get to see 3 sodium ions bind to the transport protein. This case is the carrier protein lah. Dia akan bind dekat sini. So, what happen next is that ini memerlukan ATP, don't forget. So, ATP is here. So, a phosphate group is transferred from ATP to the transport protein. Maksudnya ATP ni akan terurai jadi P and ADP. Daripada tri sudah jadi di. Maksudnya satu P tu dilepaskan. And this P, what happened to it? It is attaching to the transport protein, that is the carrier protein. Okay, next is that the transport protein will undergo conformational change. In other words, dia akan change the shape of the carrier protein. Sebab sahaja ATP, the P from the ATP bind to the carrier protein, this will result in the carrier protein change its shape. So, this will change its shape. Maksudnya sekarang ni, it is changing lah, open at the other side dekat sini. This one is the extracellular, this one is the inside, intracellular. So, releasing 3 sodium ions outside. This is outside, release it to the outside of the cell. Okay, now what happened is that, because ini adalah sodium potassium pump kan, so 2 potassium ions, okay, memang 3 ni, lepas tu ini memang 2. 2 potassium ions binds to the transport protein. Ada specific site ini. Tadi you get to see the specific site. Now this one memang dia complement kepada the potassium. So it's going to bind here. What happened is that, again, now the phosphate is released. This sudah pakai tadi. Now this is the process lah, dia punya mechanism. What happened is that the transport protein will return to its original shape after the phosphate is being released. And therefore, the original shape is like this one on top over here. What happened is that this site at the inner of the cell is open and therefore releasing these potassium ions inside the cell lah. Okay, and that is how we get to see sodium ions being transported out of the cell, and also these potassium ions being transported into the cell. And they are moving against the concentration gradient itu. Okay, so in other words, that means, so to say, that potassium ini dia kena masuk dalam sel kan, but This region over here has got a lot of potassium as compared to the extracellular. Okay, maksudnya dia sedang move against the concentration gradient itu. So that's why lah, this transport requires energy, okay, to change the shape of the carrier protein and therefore enable to transport potassium from outside to the inside. And the concentration tadi adalah against. Meaning initially dekat dalam ini adalah banyak potassium. But still we want the potassium ions to be in here. So how to get those potassium ions is through potassium sodium pump. Okay, this one is the example. Okay, ion intake by the root hairs of the plant. Okay, tadi we also use this example, but we are talking about the diffusion of water particles. Now we're talking about the ions punya intake pula. Tadi water intake. So again, study this picture. These are the cells of the roots. And you see the extended region over here. This is the root hair cells. That means this is the modified epidermal cells. Kenapa dia panjang? Usually they will ask you, why is it being modified? Because you want, kalau dia lebih panjang, dia punya surface area yang terdedah kepada kawasan sekeliling also increases, isn't it? So this promotes greater absorption lah. Absorption of water molecules and as well as ions. Okay, so the region over here yang warna kelabu ini, this represents the soil region ataupun in this case is the soil compartment. So let's look about that. The arrows. Okay, the arrows over here it says high concentration of ion. Dekat dalam ini has got a lot of ions masih. Okay, the region outside has got lower concentration of ion. Okay, so adakah ini bermaksud plants don't need ions? No, wrong. Definitely not. They still need ions. So how to force the ion into the root hair cells from the surrounding? Since the concentration of ion inside ini lebih tinggi. So it has to make use of this mode of transport, and that is active transport. Okay, so by the use of energy, in the expense of energy, mineral ions can be absorbed across the membranes by the root hair cells by means of active transport. Okay, boleh? Now, let's compare and contrast the difference between passive and active transport. Yes, first and foremost, please do not forget to mention the first point, that passive transport does not require energy, but that active transport requires energy in the form of ATP. ATP, energy that is readily, that is available to be used. Readily available to be used. Okay, the first point, boleh kan? Okay, substances move with concentration gradient. In other words, they move or they diffuse down the concentration gradient from high concentration gradient region to low concentration gradient. Okay, mesti ada dua compartment ataupun region. But for active transport, substance move against the concentration gradient. That means ini lebih susah ni, macam naik bukit. From low concentration region to high concentration region. Of course, ini tidak senang, and that's why you can remember lah that dia perlukan tenaga. Macam kamu naik bukit. Kalau this one turun bukit from high concentration to low concentration, pergerakan ni lebih senang. Isn't it? It seems like doesn't require much energy. In this case, does not require energy. This helps you to, when you think like this, yang turun naik bukit itu, okay, it helps you to remember the points lah. Okay, next. Passive transport will continue until an equilibrium is reached. Okay, maksudnya equilibrium is reached. Dia sudah mencapai keseimbangan. Keseimbangan like osmosis just now, remember the U-tube? So masih ada dynamic equilibrium. Dia akan mencapai satu level keseimbangan. But For active transport, it leads to accumulation ataupun elimination of substances from the cell. These three shows you the differences between simple diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and also active transports. Okay, it's a good summary to summarize the story that we've just discussed just now. Okay, let's just look into that. Okay, that's it about 3.2.